Hi, my name's Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Trillium. I've been thinking about Charlottesville, Virginia. You might have remembered that city that's been in the news a few weeks back, that white nationalist protest march. It got in the news because of the march and the violence, the escalating violence that led to the death of a woman. It got in the news because President Trump refused to condemn neo-Nazis groups. It got in the news because of the social media pile-on that came out of it. A few days later, there was another protest march in Boston. What made it interesting in Boston was the counter-protest. It was 20,000 strong. There's only 100 white nationalists gathered in a little gazebo in the Boston Commons, a major park in Boston. Yet there was 20,000 people who ultimately gathered around them on the outside of the park to protest them. There was a lot of commotion going on there. Interestingly, in the midst of all the signs, I found one that got my attention. It was a big sign. It said, "Love thy neighbor, no exceptions," sponsored by a Quaker group. And I was asking the congregation on Sunday, what do you think of those words? Love thy neighbor, no exceptions. Do you agree with it? And everybody said yes. And of course they should. Those are the words of Jesus, love thy neighbor as thyself. And you'd expect people to agree to that in church. I asked them, does no exceptions include the people in the gazebo? Does it include them too? And people nodded yes. Of course it does. I would have loved to have been able to meet up with those Quaker women who had the banner out on the counter-protest march and ask them in their understanding, love thy neighbor, no exceptions, did it include the people that they were protesting in the gazebo? And I imagine they would say, yes, of course it includes them too. My question would then be, well, what does that look like? What does that look like in a tangible way? What does it mean to include people in the gazebo? I was listening on a news program of a professor from Dartmouth College arguing that with neo-Nazis, violence is often the appropriate tool to use against them. And I was thinking about what he was saying, and I was kind of stunned by it all. Like that we have the right to use violence against people that we find repugnant, who we find morally repugnant or even ideologically repugnant. And it reminds me again how following Jesus is so different than the world. Jesus asks us to do one thing and one thing only. It is to be part of God's redemption to the world and to be the conduit of God's perfect love to all people, all people. At Trillium, we say offer friendship and fellowship to all, which is another way of saying love thy neighbor, no exceptions. And we're part of that, to be part of that instrument of goodness and grace to the world that puts its arm out to all people, even the people that we find most difficult to deal with in life, the people we don't really want to love, the people we want to ostracize and banish into the gazebo in our hearts, the people we don't want to offer friendship and fellowship to, includes even those people. And it got me thinking about that counter-protest march in Boston, what it might have felt like in that counter-protest if everyone was carrying that banner that those Quaker ladies had. Love thy neighbor, no exceptions. How when they got to the park at the Boston Commons, when they gathered around, they weren't there to condemn the people in the gazebo. They were there to reach out with their arms in love to their neighbor. And how the primary message they wanted to communicate that day, as I say, wasn't judgment or condemnation. It wasn't a counter-protest to the ideology of those in the gazebo. It was simply the simple statement of saying, we love you. I heard Andrew Young, who was Martin Luther King's right-hand man in the civil rights movement, talking about the fact that the only issue at stake in all this is not punishment, is not putting people down, it's about redemption. Redemption is a theological word. It simply means to buy back, to welcome back, to bring back into the fold. It is probably the hardest thing any of us do in the face of another's anger or violence, is to offer that redemptive work, to stay present to that person, neither to fight nor to run away, but to stay present to them, to seek to understand and to simply embrace that other in love. And yet the gospel tells us that that is the salvation of the world. It's your salvation, it's certainly mine, and it is the way forward for all of us as one people.